For 66 years, the man who cried hardest at her vigil was the man who put her in the ground. Her name was Adeline Broussard. Everyone in Belarus called her Addie, and for 2 years she was the voice they heard in the dark. She worked the night switchboard at the parish telephone exchange, and if you picked up your phone in that little Louisiana town after sundown, to call the doctor, to reach a son at war's old bases, to whisper to a sweetheart 3 streets over, it was Addie's voice that answered. Number, please, warm, unhurried. She knew everybody's ring. On a thick summer night in July of 1955, Addie finished her shift, pushed her bicycle out into the heat lightning, and rode off toward home along the Bayou Road. She never arrived. For 66 years, nobody in Beauclair Parish could tell you what happened between the exchange and her mother's door. And the one man who swore, every single year, that he would not rest until they found her, who lit the candle, who led the prayer, who wept at the water's edge on every anniversary for 2/3 of a century, that man was the last person to see her alive. Stay with me, because this is a story about how grief can be the best hiding place there is. You have to know Belarus the way it was in the summer of 1955 to understand what the town lost. It sat low on a bend of Bayou Fontaine in the flat green heart of South Louisiana, where the sugarcane ran to the horizon and the cypress stood knee-deep in black water, with the Spanish moss hanging off them like torn lace. It was Cajun country and Catholic country. The old people still spoke French on their porches. On Saturday nights, the accordion carried across the fields from the dance hall, and everybody who could walk went to the Fay's doo-doo, and everybody who couldn't sat by the window and listened. The air smelled of cut cane and river mud, and in July, of the white ginger lilies that grew wild along the ditches. The cicadas never stopped. The heat sat on you like a hand. It was, people said for the rest of their lives, a town where you left your doors open, and at the center of it, in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who grew up with a phone in their pocket, was the switchboard, and the girl who ran it at night. Addie Broussard was 20 years old. She was the oldest of 5, and after her father lost his arm to the cane press, she'd gone to work to help hold the family up, and she'd done it without a word of complaint. She was quick and funny and a little bit vain about her handwriting. She kept a red tin tobacco box that had been her father's, and in it she kept her treasures, a St. Christopher medal, a ribbon, a photograph, and the money she was saving toward a real life. The switchboard job was supposed to be temporary. She wanted to go to New Orleans. She wanted to hear a real orchestra. She wanted, she told her little sister Colette, to be somewhere where nobody already knew every single thing about her. But she was good to the town in the meantime. She talked the widow Petitchen down off her lonesome midnight panics. She stayed on the line with frightened people waiting for the doctor. When old Mr. Hebert had his stroke, it was Addie who heard his wife's cry and got the ambulance rolling. She was, in the most literal way, the thread that connected everyone in Belarus to everyone else after dark. And she was being courted, that summer, by a young man named Émile Thibodeau. Remember him? Handsome, soft-spoken, from a good family up the bayou. He brought her ginger lilies. He waited outside the exchange some nights to walk her bicycle home. The whole town thought it was sweet. The whole town thought they'd marry by fall. The whole town was wrong about almost everything. Here is what the record held about her last night. Addie's shift ended at 11. The exchange logbook, a real thing, kept in careful pencil, showed her last connected call at 10:52 p.m., a routine one, a man calling his brother in the next parish. She signed off. She locked the little building. And a neighbor, Mrs. Landry, sitting up with a colicky baby. saw her wheel her bicycle out into the dark at about 11:05, the sky flickering with heat lightning off toward the Gulf. Emile Thibodeau told the sheriff he'd walked her partway to the fork where the bayou road split from the church road, and that they'd parted there around 11:15, and that he'd watched her ride off toward home and then turned back toward his own family's place. That was the story. For 66 years, that was the story. They parted at the fork, and she rode off into the dark alone, and the dark took her. Her mother waited up. By 1 in the morning, she'd sent Addie's brother running to the Thibodeau place, and Emile came at once, already frantic, already leading. By dawn, half of Bellerose was out along the bayou road, with lanterns and cane knives, wading the ditches. It was Emile who organized the men into lines. It was Emile who did not sleep for 3 days. On the second morning, they found her bicycle. It was down in Bayou Fontaine, in the tea-colored water near the old sugar mill, the front wheel bent, half sunk in the mud. Just the bicycle. And snagged on the handlebar, a single white ginger lily, gone brown. No Addie, not that week, not that year, not for 66 years. The man who caught the case was the parish sheriff, a heavy-set, impatient man named Dewey Comeau, and I have to be honest with you about how he worked it, because the failures matter. Sheriff Comeau wanted it to be a stranger. He wanted it badly. A pretty girl, a bad thing, and a drifter to hang it on. That was a story a parish could close and move past. So when a farmhand mentioned that a rough-looking man had been seen hitching along the highway that week, Comeau poured most of his effort into that ghost and chased it for months, and never found him, because the ghost was probably just a tired man walking to a job. He did the rest carelessly. The bicycle was pulled from the bayou and leaned against the wall of the jailhouse, where it rusted in the rain, and the fingerprints, if there'd ever been any, ran off with the water. The one deputy who thought to ask harder questions, a young man named Alcide Saunier, who noticed that Emile's account of the timing didn't quite square with Mrs. Landry's, was told to leave the grieving boy alone. "Have some decency," the sheriff said. "Can't you see the boy's destroyed?" Because that was the thing. Emile Thibodeau was destroyed. Everyone could see it. He led the searches until he collapsed. He wept openly at the memorial mass. When Addie's mother could not stop shaking, it was Emile who held her up. He was the picture of a young man whose heart had been torn out, and who on God's green earth was going to look sideways at a boy in that much pain? So the pain became the alibi. And the case, without ever being solved, quietly stopped being worked. Sheriff Comeau retired. Deputy Saunier's questions went into a drawer. The red tin box was never found. And Addie Broussard became a candle the town lit once a year, and a name the mothers used to teach their daughters to be careful. Consider what 66 years does. Addie's mother lit a votive at St. Bernadette's every week until her hands were too weak to strike the match, and then Colette lit it for her, and then Colette lit it alone. Because Colette Broussard, 12 years old the summer her sister vanished, grew up into the keeper of the wound. She never let Bellerose forget. Every July, on the anniversary, there was a vigil down by the sugar mill where the bicycle was found, and Colette was always there. An old woman now with her sister's same quick eyes, holding a candle against the dark. And every July, so was Emile Thibodeau. He never married. The town found that unbearably romantic, the boy so broken by losing his sweetheart that he could never love again. He stayed in Bellerose his whole life. He became a deacon at St. Bernadette's. He ran the parish's benevolence fund. He was, by the time he was an old man, one of the most beloved figures in Beauclair Parish, And the reason everyone gave was always the same: that poor man. He never got over Addie. He gave the reading at her mother's funeral. He paid, quietly, for the upkeep of the Broussard family plot, the plot with the empty space in it, the space they'd left for Addie in case she ever came home. Every year at the vigil, Emile lit the first candle. Every year his hands shook. Every year he wept. If you had stood in that crowd, any July for 66 years, and watched that trembling old man weep for the girl he'd loved and lost, you would have wept too. I would have. The whole parish did. And every single one of us would have been standing next to the answer, holding a candle for the man who'd hidden it. The break came out of the water, the way so much in Louisiana does. In the late summer of 2021, a hurricane came up out of the Gulf and sat on Beauclair Parish for a day and a night. The bayou rose, the fields drowned, and when the water finally pulled back off the land, it had scoured out the bank near the old sugar mill and cracked open a thing that hadn't seen daylight since Eisenhower was president: a brick cistern, an old dry well, sealed under a slab and buried in the mud of a stretch of ground that had once belonged to the Thibodeau family. A cleanup crew found it. And in it, they found Addie Broussard. I won't describe what 66 years leaves. What matters is what was down there with her, protected in the dry dark of that sealed brick chamber, a red tin tobacco box. Her father's box. Rusted at the seams but closed, and inside it, sheltered from the rot, a St. Christopher medal on a chain, a faded ribbon, a photograph, and a folded slip of paper, its pencil still faintly legible after all those years. The case landed on the desk of a parish cold case detective. And here is one of those turns that feels too neat to be true, except that families like the Sauniers stay in places like Bellerose for generations. The detective was named René Saunier, and her grandfather was Alcide Saunier, the young deputy who, 66 years earlier, had noticed that Emile Thibodeau's timeline didn't add up and been told to leave the grieving boy alone. She had grown up on that story. She had joined the sheriff's office, in part, because of it. René Saunier read the whole old file. She read her grandfather's small, ignored note about the timing. And then she opened that red tin box. The slip of paper inside was a note, in a man's hand, and it was tender and it was terrible, a lover's note. The kind a young man leaves for a girl, asking her to meet him at the mill that night, our place, signed with a single initial. And the parish still had, in its dusty archives, Emile Thibodeau's own handwriting, 66 years of it, in benevolence fund ledgers and church rolls, and the careful cards he'd signed at every funeral. A document examiner needed less than a week. The hand that had written "Meet me at our place" to a girl in 1955 was the same hand that had signed the vigil program every July for 66 years. And there was more, because the box had kept its secrets well. The metal of the medallion, sealed and dry all those decades, still held enough to test by means the sheriff of 1955 could never have dreamed of. It carried two people's traces. One was Addie's. The other, when they finally had a reason to ask an 88-year-old deacon for a sample, was Emile Thibodeau's. They came for him on a bright October morning, at the little house up the bayou where he'd lived alone for 66 years. He was on the gallery, in a rocking chair, a rosary in his hands. He was 88 years old. He watched Detective Saunier come up the path with two deputies, and people who were there said he didn't look surprised, that his face, when he understood, showed something almost like relief, the look of a man setting down a suitcase he's carried so long he'd forgotten he was carrying it. He asked for a moment to finish his prayer. They let him. Then he stood, slowly, and held out his wrists, and the only thing he said was in French, and it was to no one, or to her, J'ai jamais art de la voix. I never stopped seeing her. The news went through Beauclair Parish, and it did not go quietly. This was the deacon. This was the man who'd held Addie's mother up at the memorial. This was the eternal mourner, the town's own broken heart. People refused it. At first, the way you refuse a diagnosis. A woman who'd known him 50 years said, over and over, that it wasn't possible, that she'd sat beside him at the vigil just that summer and watched him weep. I watched him weep, she kept saying. And that, in the end, was the whole horror of it. He had wept. Every year he had wept. He had built a life 66 years long out of mourning the girl he had killed, and the mourning had been so convincing, so constant, so total, that it had wrapped the truth in a shroud no one would ever think to lift. He hadn't hidden in the swamp. He'd hidden inside the town's own broken heart and lit a candle there every July, and no one had ever looked behind the flame. The trial was short. He was old, and the evidence out of that red tin box left him nowhere to stand, and in the end, he did not fight it. In a Beauclair Parish courtroom in 2022, 67 years after Addie Broussard rode off into the heat lightning, Émile Thibodeau was convicted of her murder. He died in custody the next winter. I'm going to leave him there, an old man in a cell, and give the rest of this to the people who earned it. Colette Broussard was 78 years old the day the verdict came in. Unlike so many in these stories, she lived to hear it. She had been 12 when her sister vanished, and she was an old woman now, and she sat in the front row of that courtroom with her sister's same quick eyes, and when the word came, she did not cry out. She pressed the old St. Christopher medal, they had let her have it back, against her lips, and she whispered something no one else could hear. Afterward, on the courthouse steps, in the wet Louisiana heat, a reporter asked her the question they always ask. Did she feel she finally had justice? And Colette, who had lit a candle by that sugar mill every July for 66 years, thought about it for a long moment. Then she said no. She said justice would have been her sister going to New Orleans and hearing a real orchestra and growing old and vain about her handwriting and surrounded by grandchildren. That, she said, was the only justice there ever could have been, and it had been stolen the night it was stolen, and no courtroom on earth could give it back. But she said she had something else now, something she'd stopped believing she would ever get. She had the truth. And she had her sister home. That autumn, they finally laid Addie Broussard in the empty space that had waited 66 years for her in the Broussard family plot. The space, it turned out, that Émile Thibodeau himself had paid all those years to keep tended. Colette had the grass over it planted with white ginger lilies, so that every July the smell of them would come up out of the ground where her sister rested. Not the flower he'd used to court her, the flower reclaimed, hers again. They buried Addie beside her mother and her father, and Colette stood at the grave in the heat and the cicada song. And she said the thing that stayed with everyone who heard it. She said that for 66 years, her sister had been the voice that connected the whole town in the dark, the one who answered when you were frightened and alone at night, and that all that time, Addie had been the one lost in the dark, with no one answering her. And now, Colette said, now she's home, and she can finally rest, and I can finally sleep, because I know she's not out there in the water anymore, waiting for somebody to pick up the line. Sit with this one a moment before you go. We think we can see grief. We think it's the one thing that can't be faked, that a man weeping at a graveside for 66 years has to be exactly what he appears to be. Bellerose believed that, and its belief was a door left open, and something walked in through it and lived there for 2/3 of a century, lighting candles. Maybe the hard thing to carry away isn't that everyone is secretly a monster. It's that the performance of love and the fact of love can look identical from the outside, and that the only thing strong enough to finally tell them apart, in this case, was the patient earth, and a rusted tin box, and a detective who'd inherited her grandfather's one unanswered question. People always ask a few things, once they've heard it all. They ask why. There's a lover's note in that box that hints at it. A young man's demand, a young woman's refusal. A rage that a good family and a soft voice had hidden even from itself. But the truth is that no answer ever fills the hole, and Colette said she stopped needing one. They ask how he lived with it, 66 years of vigils, and I don't think there's a human answer to that. Only that some people build a cathedral over the thing they've done and worship in it every day and call the worship love. And they always ask about Colette, whether she's at peace now. She passed a couple of years after the verdict, in her own bed, an old woman who'd kept a promise. They found the votive candle on her nightstand, the one she'd carried to the vigil every July. It had finally been allowed to go out. Adeline Broussard was 20 years old. She had her father's red tin box and her mother's quick hands, and a plan to hear a real orchestra someday in New Orleans. She was the voice the whole town heard in the dark, the one who answered when you were afraid. For 66 years, no one answered her. And then, at last, somebody did, and told her she could come home. If a story told with this much care means something to you, take a second to subscribe so the next one finds you. I'll see you there.